NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The law is poorly named because it is about much more than graves. Think of NAGPRA as a legal mechanism compelling any organization that receives federal funding to 1, assess what Native American collections they hold, and 2, offer to return to tribes the items they consider important for their own cultural and heritage. That certainly includes the bones and other remains of their ancestors and relatives, but it might include basketry and jewelry as well. NAGPRA also made it unlawful to excavate graves and collect human remains from government and tribal lands after 1990. That is why graves protection is so prominent in the Act's name. Some important points in understanding NAGPRA repatriation are: 1, that tribes, not curators or archaeologists, know what is and is not sacred and subject to return. 2, that repatriation is an act of returning control, not just objects. So there should be no conditions placed on what happens to items that are returned. And 3, it is a law, and a law that dictates a minimum of what is to be done within the United States. So why are so many institutions like mine out of compliance?
One of the excuses that often gets used for avoiding compliance with NAGPRA or trying to find loopholes is academic freedom. And academic freedom is really strongly tied to ethical issues like NAGPRA. And so we have some sort of do's and don'ts, what academic freedom does and does not mean, as part of this slide. And our resource is linked at the bottom in case this is something that you'd like to read more about. There's a really big misconception that academic freedom both lets you do whatever kind of research you want, but also protects you from the consequences of doing that research. And that's true at the university level. If you are doing research on something that is controversial or ethically challenging, your university cannot explicitly prohibit you from doing that work. But it doesn't mean that you're protected from legal consequences or critique by your colleagues. That's not what academic freedom is actually about. So it's really often relevant for specifically things that are related to controversial or ethical situations like NAGPRA. Some of the ways that academic freedom can be misused in these kinds of situations is that they're used to skirt around things like cultural sensitivity issues or repatriation or returning control to Native communities. So I'm going to paraphrase my favorite quote from Jurassic Park and say that often in these kinds of situations, researchers are really focused on what they can do or are allowed to do and don't think enough about whether or not they should do it. So this is the ethical component that really, in terms of academic freedom, we have to remember as researchers that what we're allowed to do should not trump our ethical obligations or our responsibilities under laws like NAGPRA. So we need to make sure that we're aware of best practices in the field and how we can do our work in a way that is in line with those things, instead of just listening to this myth of academic freedom that we can do whatever we want as researchers with no consequences.
Another excuse that is used against NAGPRA is intellectual property. As you can see on the slide, intellectual property is defined as the creations of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs and symbols, names and images used in commerce, the World Intellectual Property Organization. However, intellectual property generally has to do with patents, copyrights, and trade secrets. The misuse of intellectual property against NAGPRA is faculty members stating that a list or an inventory compiled in the 90s can be restricted from NAGPRA compliance because it is their intellectual property, claiming that emails from tribal members are their intellectual property and thus not shareable with other coordinators. I have heard arguments from curators that have said that the documentation gathered for NAGPRA compliance, including photographs, measurements, can be used for publication because it is their intellectual property, or claiming that NAGPRA data can be restricted from the tribes because it is the intellectual property of the person who put that data together.
At Vassar, a small liberal arts college in New York State, it appears that no systematic attempts were made to comply with NAGPRA when it became law in 1990. It wasn't that there was no one here that knew about the law, as my predecessor was an archaeologist who had federal permits to excavate sites on government land throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Why nothing happened then is unclear to me. I arrived at Vassar in 2012 and assumed that my predecessors had done what they needed to do decades earlier. The first clue that repatriation had not happened was when my predecessor said she was going to spend her retirement returning collections to where they belong. I took that as a statement that all was well. Boxes of collections were being moved and it seemed like they were going home. It was odd that there was no discussion and no delegations of tribal representatives. I started to ask direct questions that went unanswered. Then I started asking others and was often told to mind my own business. Someone else's research is not my concern. I started looking in boxes and in rooms that I was previously asked to stay out of. And what I found was certainly my business. As someone with expertise in NAGPRA, I knew we were far from compliance. As word got out across campus, students expressed their anger and concern. That is when professors, department chairs, and administrators admitted that they did not know much about NAGPRA. Students in my museum ethics course created informational handouts and videos. They even held workshops on NAGPRA compliance for their professors. We hosted a guest speaker in our second largest campus lecture hall, and it was so packed that people were standing in the exterior hallway hoping to learn more. They asked hard questions and expressed their disappointment in archaeologists, in anthropologists, in museum creators, and others for ignoring a human rights law. After that event, fewer of my senior colleagues told me to mind my own business. It was no longer framed as a professor's right to their own research. It wasn't academic freedom. It wasn't intellectual property. It was a college-wide embarrassment, and support shifted from protecting colleagues to rectifying the situation.
The University of Illinois, where I serve as the NAGPRA coordinator, is in a situation that is not completely unlike Vassar's. We as a university didn't have a concentrated NAGPRA effort or a campus-wide NAGPRA compliance office until 2020, which for those of you who are familiar with NAGPRA, you will recognize as being 30 years after the law was passed. The University of Illinois has a particularly complicated relationship with Native communities due to the history of the institution, and it has a complicated relationship with the state of Illinois, which is recognized as being quite behind in the NAGPRA process as a whole. So in terms of how the university's NAGPRA work has happened, we did submit inventories in the 90s as was required, but these things are often incomplete. Some collections get overlooked. And so we are currently having to undergo a re-inventory process, kind of as if we're starting from scratch. Inventories were also sent to tribes who were notified, in quotes, which means basically that letters were sent to tribes about collections inventories. But of course, we now recognize that sending a letter and never even hearing if you got a response back is not real consultation. And so we're not compliant in the way that we now understand NAGPRA compliance to be necessary. So the NAGPRA office here on campus was created in 2020, and we've enjoyed really wonderful administrative support since that time, but we're still 30 years behind. And I bring up the example of Illinois to point out that a lot of institutions are still in this situation where they aren't really sure where to start. And we're very lucky to have a lot of administrative support, but some institutions will find that they are not met with that kind of support at the outset. And so I'll turn it over to Jayne-Leigh a little bit to talk about how administrative support can really make that big difference in getting to compliance.
The speed and efficiency in which you can do NAGPRA is definitely affected by the resources and the support that a NAGPRA coordinator has from their administration. Also, if disputes come up, if faculty members are preventing access to collections, having administrators who understand the ethical responsibility, the human rights aspects of NAGPRA to step in and mediate. Also to prevent the bottlenecks of paperwork. I've heard of institutions having, taking 6 months to get a signature from a board of trustees for transfer of legal control. No way should it ever take that long. And having administrative officials who really understand that helps streamline the NAGPRA process. Also, when tribal delegations come to visit, having the administrators be an active part of those meetings, participating and showing their understanding of the law and how important those tribal relations are to the university.
Once Vassar administrators understood NAGPRA and repatriation, they supported the work. We were able to get from non-compliance to near full compliance in 1 year, while increasing student demand for Native Studies courses and generating administrative support for increasing the recruitment of Indigenous students and faculty. When administrators got involved, academic freedom and intellectual property stopped being an excuse. So our advice to you is to speak up and to be transparent. Yes, the deadline for complying with NAGPRA was 1995, but many of today's early and mid-career professionals were not at their current institutions then. Most of us were not even anthropologists. We are complicit in the non-compliance only if we allow it to continue. Speak up and speak out about these collections that need to be checked, that need to be reported to tribes through NAGPRA, and need to be returned upon request. Explain the history and importance of repatriation to colleagues, students, administrators, and museum patrons. Once they learn about it, you will find support.